Hello, everyone. This is going to be 11.3, Striving for Equality. And we're going to start with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who I believe we're going to talk about quite a bit during this section. And he said in one of his many books, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Our objectives: we're going to analyze progressives' attitudes towards minority rights. We're going to describe the political organizations founded by African Americans to promote civil rights and examine actions taken by other groups to expand their rights during this time of progressivism. So let's look at how minority groups faced the challenges in the progressive era, which is kind of ironic, I guess, the fact that, a lot of groups who could really use a progressive movement in America were not getting it because racial equality was not part of the bigger fight. Most white people were still ignoring the plight of minorities and focusing on the social impact of things that affected white people above all else. So, recent immigrants to America went through a process called Americanization, where they learned English, they learned American culture at settlement houses, basically things that would help them fit in better among white people. And the culture of their homeland was slowly replaced and ebbed out. Many progressives were still prejudiced against immigrants, and they believed that they were drunk, that they were lazy, that they were taking jobs. This led to a prejudice against foreign culture in a lot of different ways. And of course, the great irony is that a lot of these progressives also were racist in a large number of ways. They believed in that idea of social Darwinism, that certain ethnicities are just built better than others. And even progressives who argued against violence said that, race that races shouldn't have voting rights or racial equality, that groups that don't have, like Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, shouldn't suddenly be given it because they're different than us. After the Supreme Court of Plessy v. Ferguson, states both North and South still were passing segregation laws. Even the federal government got in on the act a little bit. And so this was a bad time. Even the progressive era was a bad time for to be ethnically different. Now, let's look at how African Americans promoted their own civil rights during this time. In 1905, African American leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a particularly well known historian during this time and also advocate for civil rights. They met at Niagara Falls on the Canada side because they couldn't get a hotel on the American side, and they discussed the need for voting rights. We talked about Du Bois way back in 8.3. They called their group that met there at Niagara Falls the Niagara Movement, and they called for immediate voting rights. They spoke out against, Booker T. Washington's idea of working within segregation, and they thought that African Americans should learn history, philosophy, and demand equal rights right away. The Niagara Movement did gain some followers, but not enough to sort of change things overall. So here are some founders of the Niagara Movement. W.E.B. Du Bois is in the white hat in the middle there, sitting down. In 1908, after a series of lynchings and race riots in Springfield, Illinois, and other places, black and white leaders called together for a progressive movement for civil rights. The Niagara Movement joined with several other movements to found what is called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. This organization was used to fight for equal rights, voting rights, to speak out against lynching, to speak out against, sort of bullying black voters and things like that. And they are still around today. Their group says we are the home of grassroots activism for civil rights, social justice. We advocate, agitate, and litigate for civil rights due to Black America. And in our cities, schools, and companies and courtrooms, we are the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Thurgood Marshall, who we're going to get to, and many other giants. Now, during the early 20th century, many African Americans were also moving to the city, and a lot of local agencies were sort of made to help them find employment in the cities too. And so the NAACP was doing work, but it was mainly thought of as doing work for the more middle to upper class African American. But what about the working class African American? In 1911, 100 different groups banded together to form what's called the Urban League. The NAACP was there, like I said, mainly to help out the middle class. The Urban League was helping out the lower class. They helped buy clothes and books, schooling help, and they helped people find jobs. And that's exactly what they still do today. The National Urban League, so they say, is a historic civil rights organization dedicated to economic empowerment in order to elevate the standard of living in historically underserved urban communities. So they're focusing on the cities, especially the inner cities. Now, let's look at other racial groups during this time. African Americans were the largest group, definitely, that were trying to get voting rights and more rights and trying to lessen discrimination. However, there were other groups that were also trying the same thing. And many of them tried to set up organizations to help them promote racial equality during this time. So Jewish people in America formed what's called the Anti-Defamation League to combat anti-Semitism and defend Jewish people and others against physical and verbal abuse. During this time, there was often a sort of non-official under-the-table agreement that was called a gentleman's agreement, that most white-owned businesses refused to hire Jewish people in their business or restaurants, and the ADL fought against this and still does. Their motto today is to stop the defamation of Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. Many Mexican-American groups formed during this time, sort of starting with the Urban League as sort of a template for what they were doing, helping Mexican-Americans, especially in the inner cities. One group was known as the Mutualistas. They were several groups formed by Mexican Americans to help with loans, provide legal aid. They also offered insurance. Mexican Americans were often treated unfairly when it came to hiring, and a lot of these groups fought against discrimination against Latino groups. Now, we talked about the Dawes Act back in Chapter 10. The Dawes Act was still enforced, and so there were no Native American tribes, technically. Only individual Native American farmers, and they were still subject to oppression, poverty, being ignored. Some Native groups were formed inside reservations to try to keep their heritage alive, and they also were trying to assist Native Americans with, again, getting loans and getting the money they needed. One group was the Society of American Indians, founded in 1911. Congress passed the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which made Native Americans citizens of the United States. However, Native people still had difficulty getting the right to vote, and it wouldn't be until the New Deal of the 1930s that they were considered a tribe again. So here are some Native Americans meeting with President Calvin Coolidge in 1925. Now, Asian Americans were also at risk during this time. Japanese immigrants could not, in fact, legally become citizens of the U.S., and since only citizens could own land, that meant that they were without the ability to buy land. They got around this a little bit by, once they had kids in America, they would put the land in their children's names, and then they could own the land that way. One famous example from this time of Japanese immigrants sort of working to get personhood is Takeo Ozawa, who was born in Japan, moved to America, spoke English in the home, went to a college, did all this sort of stuff. And he went to the Supreme Court trying to reverse the Japanese citizenship laws that said that Japanese people could not be citizens because they were not white. And he was denied. The Supreme Court actually stuck with the fact that since Asian Americans, especially Japanese Americans, are not white, they do not qualify for becoming American. And here's Takeo Ozawa.